The Vale Concord had 43 member species and 17 centuries of unbroken diplomatic tradition. It had survived the fracture wars, the silence of the outer reaches, and the slow bureaucratic death of 3 separate galactic charters. What it had never survived, what it had never been asked to survive, was a member of the sovereign house of Reth choosing a mate from outside the Concord's recognized bloodlines. Sarah Vale didn't think about that when she first met him. She was thinking about the oxygen recycler in Lab 7, which had been malfunctioning for 11 days, and about the cargo manifest she'd been flagging to Station Command for the better part of a week. She was not thinking about politics. She was never thinking about politics when she was working. That was, her mother had always said, her most dangerous quality. He was crouched beside the recycler housing with his sleeves rolled up, a diagnostic tool in one hand and a cup of something dark and steaming balanced on his knee. He had the quiet concentration of someone who didn't know he was being watched, which meant he was genuinely focused and not performing focus, a distinction Sarah had learned to read early. "You're the new environmental tech," she said. He looked up. Humans were expressive in ways that still surprised her. The information their faces moved through in a single second would have taken a veiled diplomat 3 formal gestures to convey. His face said, mildly startled, recalibrating, not threatened, curious. "Corvain Desh," he said. "I got in 2 days ago. Your station lead Sarah Vale." "I am. Do you know what you're looking at?" He turned back to the housing. "Partial seal failure on the secondary intake. Someone patched it with the wrong grade sealant. It's temperature reactive, so it holds fine during the cold cycle, then microfractures when the heating element kicks on. It's been venting a small amount of processed air back into the raw intake channel." He paused. "It's not dangerous yet. It would have been in about 40 days. Sarah looked at the housing. She looked at him. "You've been here 2 days," she said. "I read the maintenance logs on the transit in. I like to know what I'm walking into." That was the first thing. Not attraction, she would correct that misconception for anyone who asked, and several people would eventually ask. The first thing was recognition. The specific recognition of seeing someone operate the way she operated, quietly, thoroughly, without needing to be seen doing it. She told him she'd have the correct sealant sent from supply by end of shift. He thanked her with a nod and went back to work. She walked back to her office and filed the maintenance report she'd been building for 11 days and finally had the technical specifics to complete. That was how it started. Not with ceremony. Not with the kind of dramatic first meeting that political analysts would later try to construct from public records. It started with a broken machine and a man who had done his homework. Corvain Desh was 31 years old, born in the Meridian Station cluster on the edge of human-controlled space. His file said he had a degree in environmental systems engineering from a university Sarah had never heard of, 4 years of deep station experience, and a commendation from his previous posting for redesigning a water reclamation system that had cut waste output by 60%. His psychological evaluation, standard for anyone working on a Vale-administered station, rated him as methodical, non-confrontational, and adaptable. It also noted, in the margin, that he had an unusual capacity for patience. Sarah read his file the evening after they met. She read everyone's file. She told herself this was no different. She read it twice. The station, Outpost Yelm 9, sat at the convergence of 3 trade corridors and served as the primary resupply hub for the outer survey missions. It had a crew of 212, of which 19 were human. Humans were not uncommon in Concord space. They had been associate members for 60 years, full treaty partners for 40, and their engineers, medics, and pilots were considered among the most reliable in the outer sectors. What they were not, under the terms of the Concord's founding charters, was equals. Not legally. Not genealogically. Not in the ways that mattered to the old families. Sarah knew this. She had known it since she was 7 years old and first sat in on a Concord session with her mother, watching the careful architecture of titles and precedents that held the whole structure upright. She understood, the way one understands a physical law, that the House of Reth did not form bonds outside the recognized bloodlines. It had never happened. It was written into the founding accords not as a prohibition but as an assumption so total that no one had ever thought to write it as a rule, because rules were for things that required preventing. She understood all of this. She filed Corvain Desha's personnel report, closed her terminal, and went to bed. She lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the way he'd held his diagnostic tool, not like someone showing off their competence, but like someone who simply knew what they were doing and found that unremarkable. Over the following weeks, they developed what the station's social log would later describe as a professional relationship. They worked the same shift cycle. The station's systems were old and temperamental, and Corvain had a talent for fault-finding that complemented Sarah's administrative grasp of the station's larger operational picture. They began meeting for 20 minutes each morning to run through the day's maintenance priorities. The meetings extended. They started eating lunch in the observation bay on alternating days, where the view of the Yelm corridor's slow-turning nebula made conversation feel less like work and more like something else. He asked good questions. That was the second thing. Not the reflexive questions people asked a veiled diplomat's daughter, careful, performative questions designed to demonstrate respect without risking offense. He asked the questions he actually wanted answers to, and when her answers were complicated, he waited for them to be complicated instead of accepting an easier version. He told her about growing up on Meridian Station, about his mother who was a structural engineer and his father who taught secondary mathematics, about the particular quality of silence in a station habitat when the life support hum becomes so familiar you stop hearing it and only notice it when it stops. She told him things she hadn't told many people. About the weight of her name. About the Concord sessions she'd attended since childhood, absorbing the grammar of power before she'd understood what power cost. About the reason she'd taken the posting at Yelm 9, which was not, as the official record stated, a routine administrative rotation. Which was, if she was honest, an attempt to exist somewhere that her name was a fact rather than a gravitational field. He listened the way he read maintenance logs. Completely. Without looking for the angle. By the end of the 3rd month, she was in significant trouble, and she knew it, and she did nothing about it, and that decision, quiet and deliberate and almost entirely without drama, was the one that would eventually move through the Concord like a fault line. She did not choose him that day. She did not choose him for many days afterward. But she stopped, that evening, actively choosing against him, and in the particular architecture of who she was and what she came from, that was the same thing. 43 member species. 17 centuries. An assumption so total it had never needed to be written as a rule. She sat in the observation bay and watched the nebula turn, and she thought about oxygen recyclers, and about the way some failures were already in progress long before anyone ran the diagnostic. Outpost Yelm 9 had 212 crew members, and like all small closed environments, it had a collective awareness that moved faster than any official communication channel. The station knew things before the station's command staff did. It knew who was struggling, who was drinking, who had received bad news from home, and who was spending time with whom in the observation bay. It knew about Sarah and Corvain before either of them had said anything out loud. Talon, 7, the station's senior Vale administrator and Sarah's effective second, noticed first. He noticed in the way that careful people notice, not by observing a single thing, but by observing a pattern. Sarah had always been efficient. She had become efficient in a different direction. The morning briefings she held with the environmental team, which had previously lasted 15 minutes and covered 6 agenda items, now lasted 35 minutes and covered the same 6 items plus 2 additional ones that Talon could not identify as particularly urgent. The station's environmental reports were also, he noted, the most thoroughly documented they had been in 4 years. He did not say anything. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years, and he had learned that she arrived at her decisions through a process that did not benefit from interruption. He watched, and he waited, and he kept his concerns organized in the part of his mind reserved for things that might become significant. The human crew noticed differently. Among Corvain's colleagues in the environmental division, a Theresi named Ulm, a human woman named Calla Vries, and a Dray knight who went by Peck, there was a period of careful, affectionate surveillance. Calla, who had worked with Corvain on 2 previous postings, told Ulm that she had never seen him take this long to finish a meal. Ulm, who was perceptive in the sideways manner of his species, pointed out that Corvain had also reorganized the tool storage in Lab 7 twice in 1 week, which was not a sign of distraction but of someone whose hands were looking for occupation while their mind was elsewhere. Peck said nothing, but began making sure there were 2 cups of whatever was hot available in the lab each morning, which was the Dray Knight equivalent of a formal endorsement. None of them talked about what it meant. What it could mean. That conversation required a framework none of them wanted to reach for, because reaching for it would make it real. Sarah noticed the station noticing. She had grown up in environments where being watched was structural, where her movements, associations, and expressions were parsed by people whose careers depended on anticipating the House of Reth's next position. She had developed, young, an accurate peripheral awareness of collective attention. She knew the moment the shift happened. She knew when station lead and the new environmental tech are spending time together, became, there is something to watch here. She didn't pull back. That was the thing that would later strike the people who analyzed this period carefully. She didn't pull back, and she didn't advance, and she didn't signal anything. She simply continued. She continued the morning briefings. She continued the lunches in the observation bay. She continued the conversations that had grown, without deliberate architecture, into something she found she depended on. Corvain, for his part, was not unaware of what was happening. He was, as his psychological evaluation had noted, unusually patient, but patience is not the same as absence of feeling. He was aware that Sarah was someone whose name carried weight he couldn't fully map. He had read enough history to understand the Vale Concord's bloodline traditions, and he was not naive about what his own status meant inside that framework. He had thought about it with the same methodical completeness he brought to everything, and he had arrived at an honest position. He was not going to manage his behavior around a political consequence he hadn't caused and couldn't control. He was going to be a person, and she was going to be a person, and what happened from there would happen from there. This was either very simple or very brave. He wasn't sure which, and he'd decided the distinction didn't matter. What changed things, what moved the situation from a private development on a remote outpost to something larger, was a message from the Concorde interior. It came through official channels, addressed to station lead Sarah Vale, encoded with the cipher reserved for communications from the Sovereign House. Talon processed the incoming cue that morning and flagged it before Sarah reached her desk. She read it in her office with the door closed, and Talon, watching her face when she emerged 20 minutes later, understood 2 things: the contents were significant, and she had already decided how she was going to respond to them. The message was from her mother. The sovereign of the House of Reth was not a person who communicated informally. Her messages were composed with the precision of legal documents, each word load-bearing. This one was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph noted that Sarah's rotation at Yelm 9 would complete in 8 months. The second paragraph outlined the schedule of diplomatic functions that would require her attendance upon return. The third paragraph detailed 3 individuals, all from recognized Concorde bloodlines, all vetted, all, it was implied, appropriate, with whom preliminary conversations had been arranged. The fourth paragraph said, "I understand that remote postings create particular social conditions. I trust your judgment and your understanding of what your position requires." Sarah read the fourth paragraph 3 times. It was the most direct thing her mother had said to her in years. It was also, she understood, a warning, but a warning given with enough room that declining it remained, technically, a choice. She filed the message in her personal archive, went to the morning briefing, and at the end of it, when the rest of the team had left, told Corvain she'd like to have dinner that evening instead of lunch. He looked at her for a moment. "Actual dinner," he said. "Not a working meal." "Not a working meal," she said. He nodded once. "Okay," he said, and went back to work. That was the third thing. The way he didn't make it larger than it was. The way he accepted the shift in what they were to each other without requiring it to be announced or explained or decorated. It was, she thought, the most veiled thing about him, and he came by it entirely on his own, without knowing it, without trying. They had dinner in the station's small civilian dining room, which had 4 tables and a viewport and a dray-night cook who made something with reconstituted grain and a spiced broth that approximated comfort regardless of species. They talked for 3 hours. Calavries, who happened to be eating there with Ulm, gave Talon a look across the room that carried significant information, which Talon received and stored without any change in his expression. Later that night, Sarah stood at her viewport and thought about her mother's message. She thought about the 3 names in the 3rd paragraph. She thought about 17 centuries of unbroken diplomatic tradition. She thought about the way Corvain had said, "Okay," that morning. Not relieved. Not careful. Just ready. She didn't make any decisions that night. But she wrote her mother a reply, and the reply said that she was well, and that the station was running smoothly, and that she was looking forward to the remaining 8 months of her rotation, and that she would handle the matters mentioned in the 3rd paragraph when she returned. She didn't mention anything else. But she had started counting the 8 months differently. The Concorde interior was built on the premise that relationships between species could be formalized, that the complex and often combustible chemistry of civilizations in contact could be managed through treaty, through protocol, through the careful architecture of mutual obligation. It had, for 17 centuries, been more right than wrong. The founding accords were a genuine achievement. The bloodline traditions were not cruelty, they were, in their original form, an attempt to ensure that alliances forged by personal bond were durable rather than impulsive. Sarah had always understood this. She had understood it the way you understand a thing you've been taught by people who love you, fully, and also from the inside, which meant she understood both the truth of it and the places where the truth had calcified into something else. She had grown up watching her mother navigate those calcified places with the precision of someone walking a surface that looked solid but wasn't. The sovereign of the House of Reth was the finest political mind Sarah had ever encountered. She was also, Sarah knew, profoundly tired. Not the tiredness of a person who had worked hard, the tiredness of a person who had spent decades managing the gap between what the Concorde needed to believe about itself and what it actually was. Sarah did not want that life. This was not a new revelation. She had known since she was 19 that she did not want the Concorde's interior. That was why she'd trained in administration rather than diplomacy, why she'd taken the postings her mother had diplomatically called developmental, and her own staff had called remote. She was good at her work. She was good at the careful, unglamorous business of keeping large systems functional. She had chosen that deliberately, as an alternative to choosing the other thing. What she had not anticipated was that choosing Corvain, and she was now, privately, beginning to use that word, would not be a personal decision. It would be a political event. She understood this with more precision than even Corvain did. He was not naive, but he had not grown up in the Concorde interior. He did not know, viscerally, in the way she knew it, how the bloodline traditions functioned as a load-bearing element of the Concorde's self-concept. They were not just custom. They were the grammar of a certain kind of gravity, the belief that the House of Reth's continuity was a stabilizing force, and that anything which disrupted that continuity disrupted the balance of the whole structure. 3 member species, the Dren, the Kael'voreth, and the Morani, had formal objection clauses in their charter commitments that were historically linked to Reth bloodline continuity. These clauses were old. They had been written into the Accords in a different era, and most contemporary legal scholars considered them largely ceremonial. But, largely ceremonial, was not the same as inactive, and Sarah knew the names of at least 4 Concorde legislators who would move to activate them given sufficient provocation. A station lead from the House of Reth choosing a human mate would, without question, be sufficient provocation. She did not tell Corvain any of this during those early weeks. Not because she was hiding it, but because she was still determining what was true. There was a version of reality in which this was manageable. In which her mother's political skill and the genuine goodwill the House of Reth had built over decades could absorb the disruption. in which the objection clauses remained ceremonial. She was not yet ready to abandon that version of reality, because she was not yet ready to ask Corvain to absorb the full weight of the alternative. What she did tell him, one evening in the observation bay when the Yelm Nebula was going through its blue shift cycle and the light through the viewport was something close to beautiful, was this. My family has expectations for my return that I'm not sure I can meet. He was quiet for a moment. The hum of the station's systems filled the space between them. Family expectations or political expectations, he said. She looked at him. With my family, those are the same thing. He nodded, not surprised. Are you telling me because you want advice, or because you wanted someone to know? She thought about it honestly. Because I wanted someone to know, she said. And because the someone matters. He turned to look at the viewport. She watched his profile and thought that she was a diplomat's daughter and she had just said something about as direct as she had ever said to another person, and he was processing it with that complete, unperforming attention of his, and she was not sorry. Okay, he said again. Same word. Different weight. Talon requested a private meeting with her the following morning. He was formal about it, which told her everything. Talon was informal in private and formal when he was delivering something he'd thought through carefully. The station's communications have been flagged, he said. He meant the Concord's monitoring system, which tracked signal traffic through all Concord-administered outposts. Not illegal. Not secret. Standard protocol. The frequency of personal communications between you and the human tech has been noted. By whom, she said. Concord Interior. Specifically, the office of the Kael'Vorith delegation. She absorbed this. The Kael'Vorith delegation was headed by a man named Veth Sarandas, who had been her mother's political opponent for 20 years and who had the objection clause infrastructure organized and ready at any given moment. He was not acting yet. He was, as he always did, gathering information first. Thank you, Talon, she said. Sarah. He paused, which was unusual for him. I've worked with you for 3 years. I'm not about to tell you how to conduct your personal life. I'm telling you that the Kael'Vorith have noticed, and you should know the timeline you're operating on. She looked at him steadily. What timeline do you think I'm operating on? He was quiet for a moment. Then, the question isn't what I think. The question is what you've decided, and whether you've decided it for the right reasons. The right reasons, she repeated. Not because he's safe. Not because he's far from the interior. Not because he's an escape from something. Talon's voice was even. I've watched people make choices that looked like freedom and were really just different cages. I'm not saying that's what this is. I'm saying I'd want you to know the difference. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. She understood that it had cost him something to say it, and she gave it the weight it deserved. He's not an escape, she said. He's the opposite of an escape. He's the first person I've spent significant time with who makes me feel like I have to be more honest, not less. That's not comfortable. That's not safe. That's not running away from anything. She looked at Talon steadily. I know what this could cost. I know better than he does, actually, which is part of what I'm working out. Talon nodded. He picked up his data tablet, signaling the return to formality. The Kael'Vorith are gathering information. They won't move without a formal event. As long as nothing becomes public, you have time. Time for what? She asked. He looked at her over the tablet. To decide how far you're taking this. Before the Concord decides for you. She thanked him and he left, and she sat in her office and looked at the wall and thought about the grammar of gravity. About the way certain structures held entire civilizations in place, not because they were right, but because so many things had been built around them that removing them required deciding what you were willing to let fall. She thought about Corvain in Lab 7, crouched over a broken recycler, a cup of something hot on his knee, doing his homework on a transit he didn't know would matter. She thought, some failures are already in progress long before anyone runs the diagnostic. And she thought, so are some repairs. Corvain found out about the objection clauses on a Thursday. He found out because he was, as previously established, someone who did his homework. He had known for weeks that Sarah's position was not simply administrative. He had known that her name carried specific political weight, and that the weight had structure, that it was not just prestige but architecture, load-bearing in ways that would require engineering to understand. So he had spent time, quietly and methodically, understanding it. He read the founding accords. Not summaries, the original documents, translated into standard, dense with the particular language of an agreement made between species who distrusted each other enough to write everything down 3 times. He read the bloodline traditions, their original justification, the way they had been formalized over the first 2 centuries of the Concord. He read the charter commitments of every member species, including the objection clauses. He read the objection clauses twice, because the first time he wanted to understand them, and the second time he wanted to make sure he had. They were, as the legal scholars noted, largely ceremonial. But largely ceremonial meant they had been invoked 4 times in Concord history, and 2 of those times had preceded significant diplomatic ruptures. The most recent invocation was 90 years ago, and it had not resulted in conflict, but it had restructured 3 trade relationships and triggered a 7-year period of what the historical records called intensive diplomatic recalibration, which, reading between the formal language, meant the Concord had been close to fracturing and had not fractured only because of significant personal work by several key figures who are now celebrated in Concord public records. He sat with this information for 2 days before he talked to Sarah about it. They were in the lab. It was late in the shift, the station settling into its quieter evening rhythms, the environmental systems hum dropping half a tone the way it always did when the crew population moved toward sleep cycles. Corvain had been recalibrating a sensor array, the kind of work that required attention but left enough of the mind free for other things. I read the objection clauses, he said. Sarah, who was at the adjacent workstation reviewing supply requisitions, went very still for a moment. Not visibly, she was too controlled for that. But he had spent enough time watching her to know what her stillness looked like, and this was the stillness of someone who had been waiting for a conversation. All 3 of them, she said. The Dren, the Kael'voreth, and the Morani. Yes. He kept working, which was deliberate. He had found that conversations went better when neither person was staring directly at the other. The Kael'voreth version is the most developed. Veth Sarandas has used its infrastructure twice in the last decade, though not formally invoked it. She was quiet. Then, how long did that take you to research? About a week. The historical context took longer. I wanted to understand what actually happened the last time, not just the formal record. He set down the calibration tool and turned to face her. I'm not telling you this to create pressure. I'm telling you because you've been carrying information I didn't have, and that's not a dynamic I want to continue. She looked at him directly. This was one of the things about her that he'd learned to read as its own kind of expressiveness. Veiled diplomatic training produced people who controlled their faces carefully, but the eyes were different. The eyes said things the face wasn't saying. Hers said, right now, relief, and something more complicated beneath it. You're not running, she said. Did you think I would? She considered the question honestly. I didn't know. I wasn't sure what someone would do with that information from the outside. What did you do with it from the inside? She was quiet for a moment. Then, I counted costs. And I kept counting them, and the counting didn't change what I wanted, which told me something about what I wanted. He nodded. Same, he said. Different information, same process. Outside the viewport, the Yelm Corridor's nebula was doing something complicated with light, a slow, irregular pulse that the station's astronomers had been documenting for a year without fully explaining. They watched it for a moment together, which had become, without either of them deciding it, the punctuation they used for significant things. The Kael'voreth won't move unless there's a public event, she said. I know. Talon told you that. You talked to Talon. He approached me, actually. Corvain's voice was level. 3 days ago. He told me he was speaking in an unofficial capacity and that the conversation wasn't on record. He wanted to understand my intentions. She absorbed this. What did you tell him? That I intended to be honest about what I was and what I wasn't, and that I wasn't going to manage my behavior around political consequences I hadn't caused. He said that was a reasonable position and that he respected it, and then he spent 15 minutes asking me questions about my family background and engineering training, and I think that part was actually about getting a read on my character, which was fine. He paused. He's protective of you. Not in an overreaching way. In the way of someone who has watched a capable person have to work twice as hard as they should for everything they've built. Sarah looked at the nebula. That's an accurate characterization. He's also, I think, cautiously supportive, Corvain said. In his way. He wouldn't say it. But cautiously supportive. They were quiet together for a moment. There's something I need to ask you, she said. And I want you to answer it the way you'd answer a structural question, not to reassure me, and not to manage what I might feel. All right. If this becomes public, if the Kael'Voreth activate the clause and the Concord has to formally respond, it will be disruptive. The word people will use is crisis. My mother will face political pressure I cannot fully predict. 3 trade relationships will be reviewed. There is a non-zero probability of a diplomatic rupture that could take years to repair. She paused. Is that a weight you're prepared to carry? Not just abstractly. Specifically. Day to day. Knowing that it started because of you, and that it will follow you into every room in Concord space. He held her gaze. Is it a weight you're prepared to carry, he said. You're the one who already knows those rooms. She held his gaze right back. I asked you first. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, which she noticed and appreciated. Not quick reassurance. Not performed consideration. The real thing. I'm prepared to carry it, he said. Not because I think I can fix it or manage it or make it disappear. Because the alternative is a kind of subtraction I'm not willing to do. He paused. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand what those rooms feel like from the inside. But I know what it costs to make yourself smaller to avoid consequences you didn't create, and I'm not willing to do that either. He turned back to the nebula. I also think you'd respect me less if I was. Which matters. She almost smiled. It does, she said. Yes. They didn't resolve anything that night. There was nothing to resolve. The situation was what it was, and it would develop or not develop according to its own dynamics, and the decisions ahead were real decisions with real consequences, not problems that clarity could dissolve. But something settled. The kind of settling that happens when 2 people stop carrying the same information separately and start carrying it together, and discover that the weight is different distributed that way, not lighter, but more accurately located. Corvain went back to the sensor array. Sarah went back to the requisitions. The nebula pulsed irregularly outside the viewport, its pattern unresolved and under study. Later that night, Sarah wrote a message to her mother. Not the reply she'd been drafting in her head for weeks, something shorter, and more honest. She said, I've met someone I want you to know about. Not in the context of the 3rd paragraph. In the other context. She sent it before she could refine it into something more diplomatic. Her mother's reply came back in 6 hours, which was fast by Sovereign House standards, and which told Sarah something about how closely her mother had been watching. The reply said, Tell me more. The Sovereign of the House of Reth received her daughter's message at the end of a 14-hour session of Concord budget negotiations, which was not the ideal moment for personal correspondence, but personal correspondence from Sarah was unusual enough that she read it immediately. She read it twice. Then she set down her correspondence tablet, poured herself a glass of the mineral water she kept on her desk for occasions when she needed to think without the appearance of needing to think, and looked at the wall for approximately 3 minutes. Her aide, a young Vale named Corin who had worked with the sovereign for 8 years and had developed an accurate reading of her silences, waited until the 3 minutes were complete and then asked if she needed anything. "No," the sovereign said. "I need to think." She thought for a long time that evening. Not about the politics, she had an instinctive grasp of the political landscape that didn't require deliberate analysis. She thought about Sarah. She had raised Sarah with the specific goal of producing a person capable of navigating the Concorde's interior on its own terms. This had required, over many years, a kind of calculated restraint, allowing Sarah to develop her own judgment, her own competence, her own sense of what she wanted, on the theory that a person who had been managed into a role rather than grown into it would eventually fail the role at the worst possible moment. She had watched Sarah take the postings that looked like retreats and understood them as what they actually were, a person learning what she was and what she wasn't before she had to be anything publicly. She had not, in her private planning, factored in this particular development. But sitting with her mineral water in the quiet of her office, she found that she was not entirely surprised. She was, in fact, slightly less surprised than she wanted to be, which suggested she had known something was coming that she had chosen not to look at directly. She wrote back, "Tell me more." And then, because she was who she was, she also made 3 calls. The first was to the Concorde's chief archivist, a methodical woman named Silavas who had catalogued 17 centuries of diplomatic precedent and who, when asked about bloodline tradition exceptions and how they had been handled historically, delivered a 40-minute summary from memory that the sovereign listened to in full. There had, it turned out, been exceptions. Not many. Not celebrated ones. In 2 cases they had been kept quiet through careful administrative handling and had never become public events. In one case, in the 3rd century, a minor house had attempted formalization and had been quietly absorbed into another bloodline classification through a charter amendment that had taken 9 years to negotiate. None of these were directly applicable. None of them involved the House of Reth's sovereign heir. But the fact of exceptions existed, which was what she needed to know. The second call was to her oldest political ally, a Morani elder named Vrethsan who had navigated 4 different Concorde crises and who was trusted precisely because he had no ambitions of his own and therefore no incentive to tell her anything except the truth. Vrethsan listened to the situation and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The question is not whether there's a path through. There's always a path through. The question is what you're willing to let fall to clear it." "What do you think falls?" she asked. "Saranda's moves immediately. He's been looking for leverage over Reth for years and this is the cleanest opportunity he's ever had. You'll lose the Kael'voreth trade vote for at least 2 years. The Dren will abstain rather than object, which is their way of signaling disapproval without conflict. The Morani," he paused, and she could hear him calibrating, "the Morani position depends on how the thing is handled. If it's handled with dignity and argued well, there's a case to be made that the tradition itself should be examined. If it's handled badly or defensively, it calcifies." "What does handled well look like?" "It looks like not pretending it isn't happening. It looks like making the argument rather than navigating around the argument." Another pause. "It also looks like the human being the kind of person the argument can be made about convincingly." "What do you know about him?" "Very little," she admitted. "I'm learning." "Learn quickly," he said. "Saranda's will." The third call was the hardest. She placed it to her own counsel, not legal counsel, though that would come later, to the woman who had been her closest advisor for 30 years and who was the only person in the Concorde interior authorized, by long and entirely unofficial agreement, to tell the sovereign that she was wrong. Her name was Aelin, and she had gray at her temples and a talent for absolute honesty that the sovereign had spent 2 decades carefully protecting from political interference because it was irreplaceable. Aelin said, "Tell me what you actually feel about it, before we get to what you're going to do about it." The sovereign thought about this honestly. "I feel," she said slowly, "that I did not raise a woman capable of making this kind of decision on insufficient grounds." Aelin was quiet. "Which means," the sovereign continued, that if Sarah has decided this, she has decided it with the same thoroughness she brings to everything. Which means the question is not whether she is certain, because she is. The question is whether I trust the person she has become. And do you? Yes, the sovereign said. More than I trusted myself at her age. Aelin said, then you know what you have to do. What I have to do is going to be extraordinarily expensive. Yes, Aelin said. What did you expect when you raised someone with actual principles? The sovereign almost smiled. It was the same expression Sarah had almost made, for days earlier, in the lab on Yelm 9, and the resemblance was considerable. She wrote Sarah a longer message. It took her 3 drafts, which was unusual. She was accustomed to finding the right words on the first pass. She wrote about the political landscape honestly, without softening the parts that were difficult. She wrote about Sarandas and the Kael'Voreth and what activation of the objection clause would likely produce. She wrote, I want you to understand what this costs before I understand what this person means to you. Not because the cost should determine the decision. Because if it doesn't, if you still choose it knowing all of this, then the decision is real and I can work with real. She sent it. Then she started drafting her response strategy, because she was the sovereign of the House of Reth and her daughter had chosen something difficult, and one did not love a person well by failing to prepare the ground. Sarah received her mother's message on a Tuesday morning and read it in her office with the door closed. She read it 3 times, and by the 3rd time her hands were very still, which was what happened with her when something landed at the level of the Real. She showed it to Corvain that evening. Not because she needed him to react to it, but because she had committed to not carrying information separately. He read it. He read it carefully, which meant he read it all the way through without looking up, and then he held it for a moment before he gave it back. Your mother is extraordinary, he said. She is, Sarah said. Terrifying and extraordinary. What's she asking you? She's telling me she can work with the decision if the decision is real. Sarah looked at him steadily. She wants to know if it's real. Corvain was quiet for a moment. The station hummed around them. The nebula turned outside, its blue shifted light casting something that looked almost like dusk across the observatory. What did you tell her? He said. I haven't replied yet, Sarah said. I'm telling you first. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not like someone making a statement. Like someone who had thought about it and decided it was the right thing to do with both his hands. Then tell me, he said. She told him. The formal event, when it came, was not a scandal. That was, in retrospect, the most important thing about it, and it was entirely deliberate. The sovereign of the House of Reth announced the development through official Concord channels on a morning in the 7th month of Sarah's posting, for weeks before the rotation's end. The announcement was measured, specific, and offered with the kind of quiet confidence that had characterized the sovereign's diplomatic communications for 40 years. It did not use the word exception. It used the word development. It did not frame what was happening as a departure from tradition. It framed it as the beginning of a conversation about what tradition was for. It was, as Aelin had told her it would need to be, immaculately constructed. Veth Sarandas activated the Kael'Voreth objection clause within 6 hours. The Dren delegation issued a statement expressing concern, as predicted. The Murani announced that they were observing developments before determining their position. 17 other species in the Concord issued various statements ranging from cautious neutrality to carefully worded expressions of concern, each calibrated to avoid both commitment and exposure. Sarah heard about the activation on a Tuesday in the lab. Talon came to find her because the formal notification had come through Station Command, which was its proper channel and also meant it was now on record. He handed her the document with the same even composure he always used for significant things, and she read it standing in the corridor, and she said, "Thank you, Talon," and went back to work. She finished the sensor recalibration she'd been in the middle of. She filed the equipment report. She briefed the afternoon maintenance team. She did all of this with the complete attention she brought to operational work, because the operational work needed doing and the political situation was going to develop according to its own timeline regardless of whether she spent the day watching it. Corvain knew something had happened before she told him. He could read the particular quality of her focus the way he read environmental systems, he knew what her baseline looked like, and he knew when she was processing something beneath the surface. When she told him, he asked 2 questions. The first was, "How's your mother handling it?" The second was, "What do you need from me?" She thought about the second question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I need you to be exactly who you are," she said. "The Concord is going to scrutinize you in ways that will be uncomfortable and probably unfair, and I need you to not become smaller or more careful because of it. The argument my mother is making is partly about you. About what you actually are. If you perform something for the Concord's benefit, the argument fails." He nodded slowly. "Be myself. Be yourself in front of people who may not have encountered someone like you before. And don't try to translate yourself into terms they find more comfortable." She paused. "You won't need to. But you'll be tempted to." He thought about this. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you have to say?" "I've been thinking about this for months," he said. "I know what I am. I know what I'm not. I'm not a diplomat and I'm not a politician and I'm not going to be able to navigate Concord interior politics with any sophistication. I'm going to be the person who fixed the recycler." He held her gaze. "Is that enough?" "I think," she said, "that might be exactly the point." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Yelm 9 had experienced. The station remained what it was, a supply hub at a trade corridor convergence, with 212 crew and a malfunctioning atmospheric scrubber in Dock 3 that had Corvain occupied for most of a week. But there were new communications. Concord officials, journalists operating under press charter, an inquiry from the Kael'Voreth legal team requesting personnel records, which station command processed exactly as required by law, providing exactly what was required and nothing more. Talon handled the external communications with the precision of a man who had prepared for exactly this. Sarah handled the internal communications with the precision of a woman who had been raised by the finest political mind in the Concord. Corvain handled the atmospheric scrubber. The Murani announced their position on the 14th day. It was longer than Vrethson had predicted and significantly more nuanced. They said that bloodline traditions served a function and that function deserved examination on its merits rather than its history. They did not endorse the situation. They declined to object. They said, in language that was careful enough to preserve all of their political options, that the conversation the sovereign of Reth had invited was worth having. This was not victory. But it was not defeat. The sovereign's strategy required only that the conversation happen, that the Concord be required to look at its traditions and explain them rather than simply enforcing them. Every day the conversation continued without formal rupture was a day the argument could be made. On the 18th day, an interview request arrived at Outpost Yelm 9. It was from the Concord's official public records service, which operated as something between journalism and institutional history, and it was addressed to Corvain Desch. The request was formally worded and entirely voluntary. It asked if he would be willing to speak on the record about his background, his work, and his understanding of the current situation. He showed it to Sarah, which was the right thing to do. She read it twice. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know. If you do it, it will be analyzed by people who are looking for something to use. I know that too." He set the document down. "Here's what I think, the argument your mother is making is that this is a conversation worth having. It's hard to have a conversation if one of the parties doesn't participate." He paused. "Also, I'm a human who grew up on a station, got an engineering degree, spent 4 years doing systems maintenance on the outer routes, and ended up here fixing a recycler. There's not much in that story that's threatening to anyone who encounters it honestly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're willing to sit in front of Concord Record Service and tell them that story?" I'm willing to be the person I actually am in front of people who have only encountered me as a category, he said. Yes. She thought about what he had said in the lab, months ago, when she'd asked if he was prepared to carry the weight. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand what those rooms feel like from the inside. She thought, but he is going to walk into them anyway. Do you know what I love about you? She said, and the word was there, undecorated, and they both heard it. He was quiet for a second. Tell me, he said. You don't require the consequence to be small before you're willing to face it. He held her gaze. You're the same way, he said. That's not an accident. He accepted the interview. It was conducted via secure link, formatted as a standard record service biographical session. He answered every question completely and honestly, which took 2 hours, and the resulting record ran to 14 pages of transcript, which was then distributed through official Concord channels and, inevitably, through less official ones. People read it. All kinds of people, in 43 member species territories, read about a man who had grown up on a station much like the ones many of them lived on, who had gotten an education and taken a job and done the work carefully, and who was, when you read the transcript, exactly who he said he was, which was unremarkable in the most remarkable way. Calavrese, reading it in the station's common room, said, "That's him, exactly." And Ulm said, "Yes." And Peck said nothing, but refilled everyone's cups. The Kailvorth objection ran for 19 months. This is the part that political histories would later skip, because 19 months of sustained diplomatic process is harder to narrate than a crisis or a resolution. It was not a clean thing. It was not a comfortable thing. There were sessions in which Veth-Sarandas used procedural mechanisms to force delays and reviews that extended the formal dispute by weeks at a time. There were 3 votes that were close enough that the outcome was genuinely uncertain until the count completed. There was a period of 6 weeks, in the 11th month, during which the trade relationship implications became concrete enough that 2 Concord member governments expressed private concern to the sovereign of Reth that they could not sustain a public position they privately held. The sovereign held. She held because she was the sovereign of the House of Reth and she had made a decision, and also because she had read the 14 pages of interview transcript 3 times and had called Vrethsan and said, "I understand now," and Vrethsan had said, "Yes, the transcript was effective," and she had said, "That's not what I mean." Sarah and Corvain left Yelm 9 at the end of the rotation. Tallinn saw them off with the composure of a man who had watched something difficult become something else and was processing it privately. Calavrese hugged Corvain in the docking bay, which was not regulation, and Peck made a sound that translated, loosely, as approval. Ulm said, "Right when you arrive." Nobody said anything about what was coming, because what was coming was enormous and everyone knew it and saying it didn't help. They traveled to the Concord interior. This was not the plan Sarah had been avoiding for years. She was not going home in the way the sovereign had imagined in the 3rd paragraph of that first message. She was going home in a way that had not been written as a plan anywhere, because it hadn't been anticipated. She arrived as herself. That was the most important thing. She had spent years on the outer postings becoming a person rather than a position, and she walked into the Concord interior having accomplished that, which meant that when the political pressure came, and it came quickly, and from several directions, it found someone who knew who she was. Corvain met the sovereign of the House of Reth on a Thursday afternoon in a room that was considerably less intimidating than its furniture suggested. The sovereign had, Sarah had warned him, a talent for making rooms smaller than they were. She did not extend him the formal veil greeting, which was a political signal that he understood from his research but that she had not expected him to understand. When she realized he understood it, she looked at him for a moment with an expression that Sarah recognized as the one her mother used when she encountered something she hadn't anticipated, and which was, from the sovereign, something close to respect. They spoke for 2 hours. Corvain answered her questions with the same completeness and honesty he brought to everything, including the question she asked near the end, which was, "What do you think you bring to my daughter's life that she couldn't find inside the Concord?" He thought about this for a long moment. "I'm not sure what you bring is the right frame," he said. "I didn't set out to bring anything. I set out to be present and honest and to do the work in front of me. He paused. What I think happened is that she found it useful to spend time with someone who didn't need her to be something specific. And I found it useful to spend time with someone who was trying to figure out the difference between what she was and what she'd been required to be. He met the sovereign's eyes. I think we helped each other figure some things out. I don't think that's something you can engineer. The sovereign was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No. It isn't." She didn't endorse him that day. She didn't make any formal statement. She told Sarah, later that evening, in the private language they had developed over decades of navigating the gap between personal and political, "I understand now. The conversation is worth having." The vote, when it came in the 19th month, went against Sarandas. Not dramatically, it was close enough that the margin would be debated for years. But close margins, formally, are still resolutions. The Murani delivered the determining position. They said, traditions serve functions, and functions must be examined, and an examination that requires 17 centuries before it can occur is an examination that has been too long deferred. They did not celebrate. They did not condemn what had been before. They made the argument calmly and specifically, and the vote followed. The objection clause was not struck from the Accords. The conversation about whether it should be struck would continue for another decade and would result in a charter amendment that 3 subsequent political analyses would describe as the most significant restructuring of Concord founding documents since the 2nd century. Veth Sarandas retired from the Kailvorath delegation 2 years after the vote, citing health reasons that his own staff privately described as diplomatic. Sarah and Corvain's formalization was recorded in the Concord's official registry on a Tuesday morning in the 20th month, in a ceremony that was small and private and exactly as they had wanted it. Talon attended. Calla Vries sent a message that made Corvain laugh in the middle of reading it, which was what she had intended. The sovereign of the House of Reth sat in the front row and watched her daughter do something that had no historical precedent, and felt the particular pride of a parent who has watched someone become, against every pressure, themselves. Later, much later, people would ask Sarah what made it worth it. The cost. The 19 months. The years of managing a Concord that had been restructured by something she set in motion. She always gave the same answer, which was not a political answer and not a diplomatic answer. She said, "I stopped counting what I would lose, and I started counting what I would understand, and then the choice was not hard. The choice was just honest." Corvain, when asked the same question in different rooms, said, "I read the maintenance logs on the way in. I knew what I was walking into. And I'd seen enough failing systems to know that the fix for most of them wasn't complicated, it was just someone being willing to do it." In Lab 7 on Outpost Yelm 9, the oxygen recycler continued to function. The repair had held. It would, if the records were maintained, hold for another 20 years before requiring the next service. Corvain had used the correct grade sealant. He had done this the same way he did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without needing to be seen doing it. It had turned out to matter.